On the 1st of September 1939, the very day Nazi Germany launched its invasion of Poland and opened World War II in Europe, George C. Marshall was appointed Chief of Staff of the United States Army by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At that moment, Marshall assumed responsibility for a force of just over 170,000 soldiers, poorly equipped and unprepared for a modern global war. Throughout the period from 1939 to 1945, he did not directly command a single campaign or front, yet he was responsible for coordinating the full weight of American military power across the European, North African, and Pacific theaters. From Washington, every decision concerning the opening of campaigns, the allocation of forces, the selection of commanders, and the setting of strategic priorities passed through Marshall's office. It was this central role that led British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to describe him as the true organizer of victory. The question, therefore, is not why Marshall never went to the front lines, but how, while remaining removed from direct combat, he came to control the entire course of World War II. To understand how Marshall was able to control the entire war from that position, it is necessary to look at the nature of the task he was given, not merely the timing of his appointment. At this point, the size and strength of the U.S. Army were deeply troubling. The entire nation had only about 174,000 soldiers, poorly equipped, ranking 17th in the world, behind even smaller countries, such as Bulgaria or Portugal. The isolationist mood that followed World War I had led Congress to cut defense spending for years, leaving the army almost all bone and no muscle. Marshall clearly recognized that the United States could not enter a new war with such a weak and unprepared force. Immediately upon taking office, Marshall set in motion a comprehensive reform. He persistently pressed Congress to approve programs to expand the army and increase defense spending, despite the widespread skepticism toward war at the time. Through his persuasion, the United States enacted its first peacetime draft in September 1940, calling young men into military service. In 1941, when the draft was about to expire, Marshall personally lobbied the House of Representatives to extend it, and the bill passed by a margin of just one vote, 4 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. These sustained efforts gradually pulled the U.S. Army out of its fragile state and prepared it for the trials ahead. He also placed particular emphasis on modernizing training and equipment. As early as the late 1920s, while serving as commandant of the infantry school at Fort Benning, Marshall had revised training curricula to prepare for a new form of mobile and mechanized warfare. As Chief of Staff, he pushed forward large-scale production of weapons and military equipment. He worked closely with industrial leaders to accelerate the manufacture of aircraft, tanks, and warships, while actively cooperating with the business community to meet enormous logistical demands. Despite having to divide his attention between the military and the political arena, he understood that to win battles, one must first possess material strength. As a result, within just a few years, the United States had built a powerful armed force. The U.S. Army grew in strength at an unprecedented pace under Marshall. From a position of inferiority in both manpower and equipment, by the end of World War II, the United States military had risen to become the world's leading military power, with roughly 8 million troops equipped with modern weapons and capable of operating on a global scale. This was the largest mobilization in American history, and a significant share of the credit belonged to Marshall, whom British chiefs of staff described as the architect and builder of the most powerful army in U.S. history. Indeed, without such a force, the Allies would have found it difficult to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, adversaries that had been preparing for war throughout the 1930s. Beyond mobilizing manpower and weapons, Marshall understood that victory also required an elite corps of commanders. He was determined to rejuvenate the ranks of senior officers, breaking with the old tradition of promotion based on seniority rather than ability. As early as 1940, Marshall established a purge board composed of senior generals to review ineffective high-ranking officers. As a result, More than 1,000 officers, including 500 colonels, were forced into retirement for failing to meet the demands of modern warfare. It was a painful decision, as many of them were longtime friends and colleagues of Marshall, but it was necessary to dismantle a decaying bureaucratic machine and make room for a new generation of capable leaders. At the same time as he removed dead wood, Marshall quietly cultivated talent within the army. From the 1930s onward, he was known for keeping a personal notebook in which he recorded the names of promising young officers he encountered during his service. His criterion was straightforward and pragmatic: performance today. Whoever performed best under current conditions would be promoted, regardless of age or rank. Marshall stated bluntly that he would not send the nation's young soldiers into battle under the command of conservative and aging leaders, because modern war demanded quick reflexes and physical endurance. He remarked, "They will have a chance to prove themselves, but I fear that few of them will measure up." Guided by this vision, Marshall boldly elevated new faces to key positions, creating the outstanding generation of World War II commanders for the United States. The results of this personnel strategy became unmistakably clear during the 1941 Louisiana maneuvers, the largest military exercises in U.S. history, involving nearly 500,000 troops, along with tens of thousands of motor vehicles and horses, spread across the southern United States. Marshall's purpose in organizing these massive maneuvers was to test and temper the future command cadre under conditions as close to real war as possible. Several names stood out: Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lieutenant Colonel Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant Colonel Mark Clark, all made a strong impression through their tactical skill and creative thinking. Marshall took careful note and, once the war began, moved quickly to place them in key positions. Eisenhower, for example, rose from relative obscurity as a colonel in 1940 to become Marshall's trusted planner of U.S. strategic operations, and then advanced with remarkable speed to serve as the Allied Supreme Commander in the European theater. At the same time, George S. Patton, then 54 years old and still holding the rank of colonel, came close to being forced into retirement by the Purge Board. Marshall, however, recognized Patton's uncommon energy and tactical brilliance during the exercises and chose to retain him, assigning him command of armored forces. Patton demonstrated his capacity for rapid maneuver and aggressive attack in Louisiana and would later become a legendary figure on the European battlefields. Douglas MacArthur, a more seasoned general who had previously served as Army Chief of Staff, was likewise entrusted by Marshall and appointed as Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area beginning in 1942. Through his keen eye for talent, Marshall gathered around him a constellation of future stars who would later claim the glory at the front, yet all acknowledged the decisive guidance he had provided at the outset of their careers. In this sense, Marshall can rightly be described as the trainer of America's generals. He consistently placed the interests of the nation above personal loyalty, willing to set aside those who were no longer suitable and to elevate those who were. As a result, the United States entered the war with its most capable generation of commanders, the students of Marshall, including Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, MacArthur, Clark, and many others. They were equipped with modern ways of thinking and a determination to win, ready to lead American soldiers against the most renowned field marshals of the Axis powers. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson once praised Marshall, saying that he had known many generals in his life and that Marshall was the finest soldier he had ever known. This assessment reflected the authority Marshall wielded in shaping the human foundations of American military power during the war. If World War II is imagined as a global game of chess, then George Marshall stands as one of the chief architects who planned the Allied moves. As Army Chief of Staff and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he participated in the formulation of nearly all the major strategies aimed at defeating the Axis powers, particularly in the European and North African theaters. From the outset, Marshall held firmly to the priority of Germany, first in Allied strategy. He believed that Nazi Germany represented the primary danger and that it had to be defeated before all else. Guided by this conviction, Marshall pressed for the opening of a second front in Europe at the earliest possible moment in order to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Yet plans for a direct landing in France, first under the code name Sledgehammer and later Overlord, provoked intense debate, especially from the British side, where Prime Minister Winston Churchill favoured striking first through what he called the soft underbelly of the Mediterranean. Despite his impatience to strike directly at Hitler's centre of gravity, George C. Marshall also showed flexibility. He agreed to open a North African campaign at President Franklin D. Roosevelt's urging in late 1942. This became Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom Marshall trusted. The success of Torch paved the way for the 1943 campaign in Sicily and Italy, which Marshall likewise endorsed. In this sense, firm on objectives but flexible on methods, Marshall helped the Allies establish a critical stepping stone toward what he viewed as the true gateway to Europe. Even so, Marshall never abandoned his ultimate objective of liberating Western Europe. He played a central role in planning Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings of June 1944. In practice, many of the key strategic plans in Europe bore Marshall's imprint, from coordinating the strategic bombing campaign against Germany to organizing the movement of American expeditionary forces to Britain in preparation for D-Day. From Washington, Marshall worked relentlessly with British counterparts in the combined chiefs of staff, pressing to unify intent and to allocate resources rationally across multiple theaters. He was a strong advocate of the principle of unified command, exemplified by the appointment of Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the campaign in France, ensuring that multinational forces fought as a single, integrated force. Marshall himself stated that victory was possible only if the Allies acted as genuine partners on a common front. Owing to his powers of persuasion and strategic vision, the British historian John Ehrman described Marshall as the most outstanding figure among the Allied chiefs of staff. During the liberation of Europe, Marshall also demonstrated generosity in Allied cooperation. After British forces suffered a crisis following the defeat at Tobruk in North Africa in 1942, he decided to divert a substantial number of newly produced American tanks and artillery to Egypt, even though those weapons had originally been earmarked for U.S. forces. This timely assistance helped General Montgomery halt Rommel's advance at El Alamein. Both Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Alan Brooke later recalled Marshall's generosity in sharing resources at a moment of crisis. In this way, Marshall's role in the European and North African theatres was not at the front line but in the strategic rear, acting simultaneously as planner and coordinator, aligning Allied efforts toward the common goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Alongside the European theatre, Marshall also had to confront the brutal war in the Pacific against the Japanese Empire. Although the United States adopted a Germany-first strategy, the conflict in Asia and the Pacific still demanded immense attention and resources. As Chief of Staff, Marshall served as a crucial link between the Army, the Navy, and Allied forces operating in this theatre. In early 1942, shortly after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Marshall appointed Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area. At the time, MacArthur was holding out in the Philippines, and Marshall entrusted him with continuing the war against Japan across the southern Pacific, including the Philippines, Australia, and New Guinea. At the same time, in the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet and pursued an island-hopping strategy across key island chains. Marshall worked closely with Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, to allocate forces and supplies rationally between these two axes of advance. He had to balance competing pressures, maintaining the priority of defeating Germany, while also responding to demands from MacArthur and the Navy for immediate retaliation against Japan. It was through Marshall's coordination that, even while concentrating resources in Europe, the United States was still able to hold the line and then counterattack Japanese forces in the Pacific during 1942 and 1943. Marshall also helped shape major Pacific operations from the rear. As a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he played a decisive role in approving phased offensive plans from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Tarawa and Saipan in 1943 and 1944, and ultimately the Philippines in 1944 and 1945. When MacArthur proposed the campaign to retake the Philippines, Marshall supported the plan and, together with the Joint Chiefs, evaluated its feasibility. Even though some voices favored bypassing the Philippines and advancing directly toward Taiwan, the decision to liberate the Philippines was ultimately made, in part due to Marshall's authority and persuasive arguments in Washington. He also approved the opening of the Burma-China front to support Chinese nationalist forces, assigning General Joseph Stilwell to command the China-Burma-India theater. Although this front received lower priority, Marshall ensured that sufficient supplies were provided, including maintaining the Lido Road through the jungles of Burma in order to tie down Japanese forces in China. In the Pacific Theater, Marshall's role was expressed primarily through organization and joint coordination. He ensured that the U.S. Army, Navy, and Army Air Forces, together with allies such as Australia and China, operated in close synchronization. As a result, by 1945 Allied forces had closed in on Japan from two directions. MacArthur's forces had recaptured the Philippines, while the fleet and marine forces under Chester W. Nimitz seized key islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In this way, Marshall extended his reach to the Pacific through the commanders under his authority, maintaining the strategic principle of prioritizing Europe while ensuring that the Asian theater was not neglected. His responsiveness and flexibility played a crucial role in forming the final pincer that tightened around Imperial Japan. Victory in World War II did not come solely from sound strategic decisions or the talents of individual commanders, but also from the overwhelming logistical power of the Allied coalition. On this silent front, George Marshall was the conductor of a logistical symphony spanning 5 continents. As Army Chief of Staff, he also bore ultimate responsibility for mobilizing and distributing America's war resources. Under his direction, the United States achieved a logistical feat on an unprecedented scale. Millions of soldiers, along with vast quantities of weapons, ammunition, fuel, and food, were transported safely across oceans to every theater of war. To grasp the scope of this task, Marshall began each morning with a staff briefing before a world map pinned to the wall, crowded with markers denoting active battlefronts. Fully aware that the United States was fighting simultaneously on 9 theaters across the globe, from Europe and North Africa to the Pacific and East Asia, with more than 8 million troops under arms, he repeatedly reminded his aides that no front could be allowed to go short. On one occasion, he invited an officer to attend a morning briefing and pointed to the dense cluster of pins on the map, from Italy and France to China and the islands of the Pacific. To convey the immense complexity of the war machine, the War Department was required to operate. Marshall built an effective logistical system almost from scratch. During World War I, he had witnessed American troops suffer from shortages and poor organization, and he resolved not to repeat those failures. Under his leadership, departments responsible for transportation, supply, and quartermaster functions were tightly coordinated. He appointed logistics specialists such as Brehon B. Somerville, expanded powerful engineer and transportation units, and oversaw the construction of ports, airfields, roads, and intercontinental transport networks. The result was a series of extraordinary logistical operations. One notable example came in 1944, when Marshall directed a plan to secretly move 600,000 troops and 900,000 tons of weapons and ammunition across France in preparation for a surprise offensive, catching German forces off guard. This massive movement, supported by tens of thousands of trucks along the Red Ball Express routes, was carried out successfully, a triumph of organization to which Marshall was a central architect. In addition, Marshall coordinated wartime production between the United States and its allies, Through the Lend-Lease program, he oversaw the provision of raw materials and weapons from the United States to Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. His generosity and flexibility in this regard earned deep respect from Allied leaders, as illustrated by his decision to urgently transfer hundreds of newly produced American tanks and artillery pieces to Britain after the defeat at Tobruk. Marshall also represented the U.S. military in the highly secret Manhattan Project beginning in 1941, ensuring that the effort to develop the atomic bomb proceeded smoothly in service of ending the war. Marshall ran the global wartime logistical machine at peak efficiency. He ensured that every soldier at the front, whether in the jungles of the Pacific or the snow-covered mountains of Italy, received the supplies necessary to fight. The immense material strength that Marshall organized and distributed sustained Allied military operations, delivering overwhelming firepower to every battlefield and playing a decisive role in the final victory. The magnitude of George C. Marshall's contribution, though largely carried out behind the scenes, was recognized with particular admiration by both allies and later generations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who worked closely with Marshall throughout the war, regarded him as the finest military mind he had known and entrusted him with the heaviest responsibilities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called Marshall the organizer of victory in World War II, acknowledging him as the architect who orchestrated the common triumph. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, also remarked that Marshall stood above other chiefs of staff, consistently placing the broader Allied interest first and willingly sharing resources when necessary. American contemporaries, such as financier Bernard Baruch, praised Marshall as the world's first global strategist, a tribute to the rare breadth of his vision. Many fellow generals held Marshall in the highest esteem. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower acknowledged that the vision and determination of one man, Marshall, had prepared the War Department for World War II, and that he had steadfastly taken the hard road to build the army, regardless of the personal cost to himself or to others. Eisenhower also expressed deep appreciation for Marshall's selfless spirit of service. Although he longed to command troops in the field, Marshall would say that he was there to serve, not to satisfy personal ambition. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson praised Marshall as the greatest soldier he had ever known, a judgment of particular weight coming from a statesman with such extensive experience. Even more striking, President Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt's successor, declared bluntly that in a war unprecedented in scale and ferocity, millions of Americans had served their country with distinction. Yet it was General George C. Marshall who had delivered victory. Truman later referred to Marshall as the man who won the war when honoring him after 1945. These assessments reveal how Marshall was widely regarded as the spirit behind the Allied victory, despite his limited public profile and the fact that he never personally commanded an army in the field. Later generations of historians echoed this view. They portrayed Marshall as a model of the modern commander, one who won wars through intellect and administrative mastery rather than battlefield spectacle. Many likened him to a Napoleon behind a desk, a supreme commander whose influence extended across every front, despite remaining far from the fighting. Historian Mark A. Stoller drew a telling contrast when he observed that Douglas MacArthur was the last general of the 19th century, while George Marshall was the first general of the 20th, meaning that Marshall inaugurated a new era in the comprehensive direction of modern war. For these exceptional contributions, Marshall came to be recognized not only as one of the greatest generals in American history, but also as a statesman of global stature, the author of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt post-war Europe and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. Yet, it was his role during World War II that defined him most clearly as a general of generals, a commander who directed operations from the highest strategic level. This inevitably raises a persistent question. Why did George C. Marshall, with his ability and his 5-star rank, never directly command troops on the battlefield during World War II? In truth, Marshall deeply desired such an opportunity. a natural ambition for any professional soldier. In 1943, as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion to liberate Western Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt weighed Marshall against Dwight D. Eisenhower for the position of Supreme Commander. Marshall had never led troops in combat, and he regarded the chance to do so as the dream of a lifetime. Yet, as a man of absolute loyalty to the nation, Marshall never sought to advance his own claim. He even told Roosevelt that the president should decide freely what best served the country and not concern himself with Marshall's personal wishes, adding that he would gladly accept any assignment the president chose. After long deliberation, Roosevelt concluded that Marshall was indispensable in Washington and appointed Eisenhower to command Overlord instead. In a private and candid moment, the president told Marshall that he did not believe he could sleep soundly if Marshall were not in Washington. That remark stands as the clearest possible affirmation of Marshall's irreplaceable importance within the machinery of wartime leadership. For this reason, the general did not go to the battlefield simply because the president and the nation needed him in a higher position, the position of coordinating the entire war. He understood that if he immersed himself in a single campaign, no one else could fully shoulder the immense burden at general headquarters. Marshall's decision to remain in the rear reflected extraordinary self-sacrifice and a profound sense of responsibility. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower later remarked that Marshall had certainly wanted very much to command troops at the front, but he would not allow his superiors to know it, because he said, "I am here to serve, not to satisfy personal ambition." History bore this out. Precisely because Marshall stayed in Washington, the entire machinery of war was able to operate smoothly. Without his overall coordination, the Allies would likely have struggled to achieve coherence among theaters, services, and the political leadership of different nations. A telling example came in 1944, when Eisenhower was directing the Normandy campaign in Europe, while Douglas MacArthur was advancing in the Pacific. At the same time, Marshall was overseeing support for both fronts, ensuring that Eisenhower's forces had sufficient reinforcements to drive straight into Germany, while MacArthur's troops were not short of landing craft for the reconquest of the Philippines. Clearly, no general at the front could have done this. Only Marshall, with his global perspective, could manage such simultaneous demands. As a journalist wrote in Time magazine when Marshall was named Man of the Year in 1943, Marshall was not the soldier who won a battle. He was the commander who won the war. It was precisely his absence from the battlefield, contrary to conventional expectations, that proved to be the right decision, enabling Marshall to control the war more effectively and guide the Allies to final victory. George C. Marshall stands as clear proof that in modern warfare, victory belongs not only to those who fight at the front, but also to those with exceptional intellect directing events from the rear. Throughout World War II, Marshall quietly yet firmly steered the vast war machine of the United States and its allies. He built from scratch an army numbering in the millions, chose the right men for positions of responsibility, devised sound strategies for each theater, kept the Allied coalition unified, and ensured that soldiers at the front received the support they needed. If the war is imagined as a great drama, then George Marshall was both its playwright and its director behind the scenes, rarely seen in the spotlight, yet decisive in determining the outcome of the entire performance. He emerged from World War II not with the flamboyant fame of a battlefield hero, but with the respect of the world for an exceptional mind. Winston Churchill wrote of him, "There are very few men whose intellectual capacity and personal integrity have impressed me as deeply as General Marshall. He truly was the organizer of victory." On the 26th of November 1945, President Harry S. Truman awarded Marshall his second Distinguished Service Medal and declared, "In this war, George Marshall brought victory to the nation." More than 60 years later, Marshall's name is still spoken as one of the greatest generals in history, not because of feats won on the battlefield, but because of the vision, leadership, and quiet dedication that shaped the outcome of World War II. He was the first global commander in American history, a humble hero who chose to stand behind the scenes so that others might shine. Through George C. Marshall, the so-called Napoleon behind the desk, the course of World War II turned in favor of freedom. That is why, despite never fighting on the front lines, George C. Marshall was able to control and determine the course of the Second World War in its most comprehensive sense.